Alrighty, folks, episode 101 of the Q&A. Remember, if you like these Q&As, hit that like button for the algorithm. For the algorithm, friends, hit it now. Instead of decreasing the rate of progression for a movement that we are doing multiple times a week, does it make more sense to reduce the frequency and double the rate of progression and maybe add another movement because we are now doing less volume for the muscle that movement targets? So there's a whole bunch of assumptions that are being made here that are completely incorrect. But let me first just say that we all know that exercise rotations are a completely valid approach. When you take a movement that you are receiving plenty of stimulus for, but you're actually having a recovery issue, so a good example of this could be, say, deadlifts. Trying to deadlift every 48 hours is probably not going to work because you're going to be limited by lower back recovery and axial fatigue. However, hamstrings and glutes can potentially be trained every 48 hours, so you might pair a deadlift with something like a leg curl. This type of pairing is actually going to increase the stimulus that you get because it improves the overall SFR of the program for your hamstrings. But this only works because you were having a recovery problem with deadlifts to begin with. If you take a lift like, let's say, a shoulder press or a lateral raise, and you go to add 1% load and you lose just one rep, this is often indicative of more of something along the lines of a stimulus problem. And you are not going to fix a stimulus problem by cutting the frequency and volume in half. So no, it doesn't really make more sense at all to say I'm going to do a movement half as often with less overall volume and I'm going to double my rate of weight addition. That's probably not going to work. Now, you could say, well, I'll add an additional set and thus keep everything volume equated. Now, is that approach better? Maybe, it could be. You'd have to test to see what happens. However, unless doing 2 sets every 96 hours better matches your personal stimulus recovery adaptation curve for that muscle, you are unlikely to get more hypertrophy doing that because think of it like this. 2 sets on the same day means 1 top set and 1 back off. You're going to have to reduce the load for that second set. Meanwhile, if I'm doing 1 set every 48 hours and I'm setting a very small PR each time, I'm doing the same volume as you, but the loads that I'm using on average are higher than yours. Every set that I do is a PR, whereas half of your sets are back offs. So I want to make sure I'm being very clear once again. Exercise rotations are often an excellent strategy, and intelligent pairing of exercises can actually lead to a situation where 1 + 1 = 3, and not only do you get a better SFR across the training week, but you actually progress faster, have less overuse injuries, and you target a wider variety of muscle fibers. So again, exercise rotations absolutely have their place in novice, intermediate, and advanced programming. However, this question is in the context of my system, which uses the 1% rule. So let's talk about the 1% rule one more time. It's not a real rule. I completely made it up. It's a heuristic to help guide people on rate of progression. The entire basis for the 1% rule is as follows. I noticed that for intermediate and advanced trainees, that if they're using a strict double progression model where the weight stays static from week to week and they try to add more reps, I noticed that they often are able to add reps once every 2 to 4 weeks. This is for hypertrophy programming, not strength training. Strength training progression is much slower. So if they are adding 1 rep every 2 to 4 weeks, that means 1 rep every 3 weeks on average, which equates to roughly 1% increase in strength per week. So one of the reasons I even came up with quote-unquote simultaneous double progression, which is ultra gigabrain, as Bald Omni-Man would say, nerd speak for I add a little bit of weight and try to add reps at the same time, whereas traditional double progression, you stick on a weight and try to add reps until you max a rep range. The reason I came up with that is so that I could see if it was actually working every single week. Because if I'm able to add 1%, I know that I beat last week, which is a psychological win, but on paper, it also lets me see that the programming is working rather than being, kind of up in the air for 2 to 4 weeks at a time until I get that +1. One of the coolest things about simultaneous double progression is that it's still double progression, which means that your rate of progression is auto-regulated. So even if you don't add 1% per week and you add 0.25% per week, you can still add reps. So it doesn't truly change your rate of progression at all because your rate of progression is auto-regulated by how many reps you can get. Here's the last thing that I want to say about this. The more advanced you get, the more you're going to appreciate fucking with something when it's working. This is very similar to Mike Teixeira's emerging strategies, where basically they'll take a block of training, and if it works, they don't change anything. They don't change the microcycle. They just run the microcycle again. And I've heard Sam Sheethar talk about this as well, and he's a 560 plus pound bencher. He says, you know what, if I ran a bench cycle and it gave me 5 to 10 pound PR, then I'm just going to run it again with literally zero changes. So for me, if I'm on a high frequency program and I have two different options, I'm going to choose the simplest option that with what I am doing currently the least. Understand? How do you progress weighted dips safely? I've seen a few pec tears lately. Are they even beneficial? Good God, man. I'm going to use a car analogy for you, okay? I've seen a lot of car accidents in my life. I don't stop driving my car. If you're not driving a souped up car, aka you're not enhanced and you're not going 40 miles above the speed limit, weaving in and out of traffic, tailgating people, aka trying to set 50-pound PRs, making huge jumps every time, maxing out every single week, slamming into the hole with no eccentric control, then your risk is going to be very low. And if you can't handle low risk, don't lift. Would it be stupid to do eccentric only curls where you lower the weight with one arm and then lift the weight with the other arm? Well, why the hell are you doing that? If you're trying to build muscle or you're trying to gain strength, we know that the concentric is an integral part of building both of those qualities. Now, if for some reason you're doing something like eccentric only tendon rehab, then that could potentially be very smart. So it just depends on why are you even doing this in the first place? Is this an intensity technique where after you do a normal set, you're trying to go beyond failure? That's something you could play around with. But in general, eccentric only training causes a ton of muscle damage and the SFR is going to be really poor. Stick to the boring basics. How would you go about programming if a man has disproportionately large glutes? Would you remove all hip hinges and only do squats with a quad bias? I wouldn't do anything differently at all. Here's why. You don't have disproportionately large glutes. There is a 99.9% chance that's bull. One, the most likely and obvious explanation, body dysmorphia. Two, some people simply store a lot of fat in their ass. It's very common in women, but it happens to some men too, where a disproportionately large amount of their fat is stored in their butt. And when they get lean, they realize, oh, they didn't have disproportionately large glutes after all. They literally just had a fat ass. Second, take me, for example, where I actually have a disproportionately large body part. My adductors are practically at a pro level and nothing else is close. I have never once considered taking out hip extension movements that train the adductors like deep squats and RDLs. I've never once considered shrinking my adductors. It's good to have a freaky body part in bodybuilding. Now, if you're just talking from your own personal sense of aesthetics and you have your own personal sense of balance, you still don't want to take out hip hinges because it's the only way to train the hip extension function of the hamstring. You just want to make sure that when you're doing a hip hinge, you are doing it with a very open knee angle that biases the hamstrings instead of the glutes. But I really wouldn't change anything, and a lot of you who are basically just intermediates get carried away with specialization when you don't need any. Alrighty, folks, that is it for today's Q&A. My goodness, I am exhausted. Please enjoy these cool sand sculptures that I saw at the beach today, though. As always, if you guys enjoy the Q&A, please like it on YouTube when it comes out on YouTube. If you'd like to support in a more substantial way, you can become a supporter of the Q&A on Patreon for $1 a month. I'll put a link here on the screen somewhere, and you can find a link in the description box if you're watching this on YouTube. Likewise, if you would like to work with me directly for coaching or check out any of my ebooks, you can find the information to do so in the description box on YouTube or in my bio on Instagram. I am super backed up on questions, so I will probably not be putting up a new box for a while, because I want to catch up all the questions that everybody's already asked me, as I do try to take a little bit of pride in answering every single one that I get. I do skip some that aren't appropriate for public forums, but until Sunday, my friends, have a great rest of your weekend.